Hi, this is Fran with Stampendous, and many of us may be cocooning these days, but I say it's time to keep calm and craft on. And we have a wonderful class 108 for you today, and we're going to be using our clear stamps with the sketchy birds and the moonlit wings and the sunrise sunset clear stamp sets. As you can see here, I'm using the Daniel Smith paints, my favorite brush. We've got a color wheel to help us understand these 6 colors. And we have a diagram that has helped us lay out all of the paints in the palette exactly the way that is easiest to work with. And we're using our Canson watercolor paper. A couple weeks ago, we talked about different styles of painting. We talked about minimal style, a whimsical style, natural style, and even a mixed media style. So what we're going to start with today is going to be a bit of whimsy and a bit of mixed media. If you've been moving your palette from one place to another, I wanted to show you again that I have a strip of clear duct tape, as they call it, that protects all of the paints in the pockets of my palette. And I've got all of the colors in place. I'm going to spritz it just to get everything revived here with the paint. My spray bottle, and I also have my little squirt bottle. And I'm going to, with this needle tip, get some bit of water in each of the palette areas where I want to establish some puddles. We're going to paint these 3 different variations kind of back and forth. So we'll have them sitting out so that we can observe them as we go along. Okay, on this first one we're going to work with some of the cool colors and a more monochromatic approach. And so I've mixed some of each of these colors. And I'm going to start with some purple. Kind of test that and start with that up here at the top. This time I'm going to work around my message area and see if we can get a nice look with that approach. And while things are still wet, I want to get a darker purple. So wet on wet, we'll add some more purple, and I'm doing kind of a dotty approach here to just let the colors blend together a little bit. And now we'll add the blue. I didn't clean my brush, so those two will mix together a little bit, which is kind of on the dark side. So I'll move it up into there. I'm going to clean my brush in the swamp in order to preserve some of the lighter blue next. This is now the Phthalo Blue. All of these colors will blend together very easily color-wise, from purple to blue and next to some greens. And this time I will paint in the birds. I've been requested to not stop at, at the backgrounds. So now let's add some of our greens, and wet on wet, we're just going to let them blend together down here. It's looking a little bit thin, so I'm going to come back in, make sure I get a little bit darker green. The shape around my message is a little bit awkward, so I'm taking a damp brush and softening the edge with some water. And I'm going to darken it some more now that I see how it's drying. And again, if I do some big splashes of color, that will look like the irregularities of the sky and the clouds. Okay. While that's drying, we're going to move over here to this one. And I didn't mention much about how I laid out my paper and the taping, but each of these are 3 1/4 square. And I taped the 2 watercolor panels down with a little spot of tape with a 1/2 inch in between. And that gave me the width of the tape to get that small, like 1/8 inch border all the way around on each of those. And you can see here that had a nice clean edge to it. So make sure you remove the tackiness of your tape, and then you can press it down firmly all the way around the edges. I did that in advance, and I also did my stamping. And again, I tested my message on scrap paper to make sure I had the feel of that message stamp so that it would be very nice and clean impression on my watercolor paper. Now with a clean brush, I'm going to go to my yellow. Make sure I get a nice vivid yellow to start with. And I'll do that over this area so that the words are the most readable. That's an easy choice. And now I'm going to work my way around in rainbow color wheel spectrum here, adding the Gamboge next, and just working wet on wet. And again, because I had all my puddles prepared ahead, this makes it very easy to move from one area to another. Doesn't matter quite how they mix and blend together. That was scarlet. Now I'm going to the rose. Oh, it's just such beautiful color. Sometimes the paint will kind of pull away from the edge of where you've stamped. So I'll come in with a not too wet brush. You can see it's not running all over the place. And now I'll go to my magenta. I could see these colors were mixing together, but since I knew that I'd be using some of that, I was okay with it. I hated to just wipe it away. Now I want some nice purple. Okay, and having that darker color underneath them works quite nicely. Okay, and now I'm going to move to my blues, and since this is kind of an extra blue area, let's, that's rather dark blue just because of the purple I had on my brush, so I'm going to clean it off and see if we can preserve some of the lighter blue. Here we go. Okay, it'll mix in, but that'll still give me some more of the phthalo blue. And in this mixed media approach, I'm happy if the colors kind of mix together. I've placed them intentionally in the color wheel order, the way they mix and blend the best, and I left a little bit of room for each color going all the way around. Okay, and again, it's best if you can do it in one pass. The more I go back and play with it, the more watermarks I'm going to get. So, okay, I even planned this out so that I could simply turn it, and these two still need time to dry, but now I'm going to move to this side, and we'll put this card over here. It just so happened, after I had done this one, just playing around initially, I found that all of the colors that I was mixing all came from this one quadrant of my palette. So that makes it very easy to use all the colors and everything that mixes in between here. So I think I'm going to, looks like I smudged a little bit down there, so hey, we'll put purple down there. So I'm going to start with some purples down here, and we're going to let all these different colors mix together. The purples, the reds, rose and scarlet, all of these colors, just the way they're blending in here, is going to work up here on my watercolor panel. It's just beautiful color. Okay, so now the backgrounds have had a chance to dry, and I'm going to come back to this one, and like happened in my first one, some of the colors were just kind of patchy, and that's what gave me the idea initially to do this little polka dot business. So you may have the same challenge or just really like the look of this, so that's what we'll do. Now I've got to be careful that I don't touch the one down here, but I'm going to come in and just do brush tip type dots. They're looking too uniform. You don't want them in rows. You kind of want an irregular look here. And since that was the dark color, now I'm going to shift to a lighter color. Okay, so we'll let that dry, and we'll come over here and work on our next little bird. So this one, the light blue, was just kind of a nice contrast to this area of the oranges and reds. So let's see if we can maintain a nice soft phthalo blue here. And again, you'd want to make sure your background colors are dry, and then it's safe to come in here with a nice soft blue. Okay, and that should be just about right because it's going to dry a little bit lighter than that. And let's test doing our little dots here. Okay, that's a fun little bird. Okay, so I think we can paint our little bird on this side now. And we'll just start with our yellows. I skipped over the Gamboge. Come back to... One of the most colorful birds is a painted bunting, and they have feathers in all this beautiful range of color. They may not be placed in exactly what I'm doing here, but this is an easy sequence of colors to work with. Okay, that just gives you some fun ideas anyway. So regardless of where you placed your colors in the background, keep in mind as we color in the birds to look for complementary colors. For example, I put the yellows next to the purples because they're complementary colors. And if you want to put blues next to oranges and reds next to greens, it just will make for a very vibrant color scheme and gives you an easy place to go if you can't quite decide what colors you want to do. I'm going to wait to do some more of that patterning in the background, but let's go to painting in our birds. If I'm not always testing my color on the paper, it's because I've gotten comfortable with kind of knowing what to expect from how I've been working. And if you're not yet to that point, then be sure and keep following my suggestion that you test things, if need be, on a little test strip of watercolor paper. You'll notice with these that I had no problem stamping over the tape on the edges. It gave me a dynamic layout where I got all their little beaks. They're all talking together, and I thought that was a fun way to do my little layout here, and we'll just darken a little bit here and there for interest. I can see that my yellow is clean there, so that's helpful. And I keep forgetting to paint their little beaks, so let's make sure we do that. That was too wet, and that's part of testing. Lifted a little bit of that away. It's such a small little area. Okay, so we've done our beautiful yellows, and I'm going to follow the same colors that I did here. So here's my lime green, and if your background colors have dried at very vivid colors, then you might do softer colors on the birds, and that will give contrast. Oh, and while we've got some green, here we go, we'll do the leaves up here. And now to shadow that blue in what's maybe a mostly white area, I want just a little bit of gray. And actually my little puddle down here is looking okay, and that's looking darker than I want. So I've cleaned my brush, blotted it, and now I'm going to mop up a bit of that. And since the wing was still wet, it's traveling a little bit. Okay, that'll work. I'm going to mop up the flowers in the front and see if I can darken a little bit the area of the petals that would be in behind. Okay, so now let's do some of these playful patterns in the background. We know this purple or magenta will show up against the reds. So I did a couple of little stripes. Let's do some big purple polka dots down here where it's kind of tone on tone. And now if I use a strong rose or scarlet, that should show up in this area. And now I'm doing some smaller little dots with kind of two little brush strokes. Okay, so that's just kind of fun and whimsical look there. And I don't want to rush it by taking the tape off, so we'll give you another close-up of the finished cards. Next, with the moonlit wings, I've got a 3 and a little bit shallower, like a 3 by 3, and over here 3 1/4 by 5. And I left only a 1/4 inch between using my little grid, and that gave me the tape edges that I was looking for. And the size doesn't really matter in terms of how much of the taped edge you have, but do keep it the same on each panel if you can. On this one, I left a little bit more down at the bottom to make it a little bit more the size of this original, and I can cut away some more of that white if I want to. So there were kind of 3 different ones that I'm going to play off of here today with what we're going to paint. And I'll just mention, using your masking tape, you want to make sure to kind of remove some of the tackiness of the tape a couple times, and then when you press it down, that should give you a nice clean inside edge, and you'll still be able to remove it later without tearing the paper. So I used the clear stamps on the blocks, and as always, I stamped with the VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and it has had time to dry. I'm going to paint the dragonflies and butterflies first, and we'll see how this works compared to doing the backgrounds first. You just have to always experiment, and part of that will be my effort here to kind of get the light colors of the moon. So we're going to start with our yellows. So over here, I'm going to do washes not only on the moon itself, but around the perimeter as well. Put a lot of the yellow with a little bit of the gamboge. Okay, and I'm going to paint the yellows as though all of these moths to the flame here are facing this beautiful moon, and we're going to do some yellows to emphasize that idea in what's closest and facing the moon. Then we'll get some of our lime green over here with our yellow with the phthalo blue in this pocket. Gives me my Kelly greens as a medium, and with more yellow I can get the lime color that I'm looking for. It's a little bit thick on my brush, as I could tell by testing it, so I'm going to do just a little bit in places near the dragonfly's body. I'm going to wash off my brush, blot it, and now with the damp brush I'm going to move this out a little bit. Okay, that seems to be the best way to do some shading there. And again, I'm going to enhance the lightest color facing the moon. I saw this documentary where they were studying all of these night bugs and things, and they put up a sheet with a light behind it, set up their camera, and got incredible view and photography of all of these nocturnal critters with wings. It was quite amazing. Better to see on TV than to have been there in person. Actually, on this side, if I'm going to do a dark background, I want to keep the dragonfly wings pretty light, and since their wings are quite translucent and gossamer, then we would see this light green actually all the way across on these, I think. Over here I'll add a bit more of some of these other colors. I added some green and just kind of work in a symmetrical pattern from one wing to the other. One day there was a beautiful dragonfly sitting on the parking lot, just sitting there, and I ran and got my camera. I was afraid to touch it. I didn't know if it was still alive. And I took a picture of it sitting perfectly still there on the pavement. It was amazing. And then later it was okay and it flew off. And I was so glad that I'd been able to observe it so close and that the dragonfly was okay. Okay, so I did more color on this one given what we're going to do with that background. And we may speed this up just so that you get the idea. The difference between these two was that this one I did a blue wash everywhere and I let it dry, and because it was uneven I waited until it was dry to go back and do the stippling of dots that solved some of the awkwardness of my washes. On this one I worked more wet on wet, and it's given me a different but very interesting look. So you can experiment with those two approaches. And when this dries, I may go back and do a little bit more of a dry approach to add to it at the end. With this one, you can see I got a lot of really strange watermarks. And when it was wet, I thought I had perfectly blended the whole thing. But when it dried, obviously it hadn't, because I can see all of these watermarks. But it's kind of fun for a dark sky, and so I wanted to show it to you. And now who knows what will happen over here. But I do know that with this one I was trying to keep the colors really dark, and they dried lighter than I wanted, and that's why I did all of the stippling on this one. So let's give it a try. We've let the yellow dry completely up here, so let's see how we can get a nice dark interesting sky here. So we actually had quite a bit of a green color that looks like it's mostly just from working over the yellow. So we won't add green, but let's start with some dark blues and see how we do here. The darker the background, the more the wings of the butterfly and the dragonfly will just pop. Yeah, I wanted a real intense blue here, especially in the corners. I want to lighten it here around the moon and darker on the outside edges. Since the yellow is dry, it's not going to mix, but it is going to affect the color. So I'll try my little circular lines, kind of like we did last week. Okay, so here we have quite a few different variations, and it's kind of fun. You're going to improvise perhaps as you go along. I hadn't planned to do this approach, but I think it worked quite nicely. And these other colors are staying nice and dark, so I may not need to do the stippling that I did on this one. And again, this stippling and over here were done when it was dry, and I had a rather dry brush with some very intense color to do all of those little dots. And on this one, I made a nice backdrop for the card with the little dragonflies. Now we're going to try some sunrise, sunset out over the ocean or water kind of look. And this is going to give us opportunity to try a couple other things. And as you see here, I have taped my little narrow panels and a little bit wider one, and I taped them all down as usual, and I decided that drawing a horizon line would be helpful. And what happened on this one was I didn't have a horizon line, so I had to kind of figure out what I was doing as I went along. And then with this one, I didn't have a line, and when I drew it in all wobbledy, I wasn't too happy with that. So, so now we're giving you the tips to go right to something that should work the best. And by making it the same on both, that was an easy way to just take my nice micron permanent pen here and draw a horizon line. And this will help me determine where I'm painting sky and where I'm painting water. So the water is going to reflect. So what I do above the line and what I do below the line will be similar to this approach. And we can only hope the one we paint right now comes out as lovely as this one, which is why we've got it sitting here. With a little bit of water, I'm going to start again with my yellow. I think this, starting with yellow, is helpful for me as I'm working with the horizon line here to just kind of decide what I'm doing. And I'm going to work on the two of them similarly. And so if we have the sun coming up or going down, depends which coast you're on here, we're going to use some yellows. So I've stamped ahead on this one. And I think the movement of clouds kind of going up at a diagonal like that makes it interesting. And these two could have been together, but I'll probably use them on separate cards. And for now, I don't want this little couple sitting out there in the ocean, but we'll give them a little rock to sit on when things are dry at the end. I won't leave them floating. Okay, so I'm adding some water to make sure that edge is wet. And over here the colors were pretty intense, so I'm okay with a little bit softer colors here. So we'll try adding some of the Gamboge. And again, I'm kind of moving my brush in shapes that might seem cloud-like. And I didn't mind leaving the white there along the horizon, kind of as the brightest point there. And while we're working with these colors, I didn't want that line to be totally wet there. So, but I am going to, so if you'll notice, the sky has a lot more detail of the clouds. I let this area be a lot wetter so that the reflected color could be more of a wash. And over here, we're going to let it define the horizon a little bit more. And how the color is reflected is all, you can look at some photos to study some examples. But again, my approach goes so quick and it's difficult to make an exact look of something, so I'm giving you the freedom to just do a random sort of approach here. Now I left that area to dry and moved on to another area, so it's going to give me a hard line, but I think the shape of it is kind of interesting cloud-like, so I'm okay with that. Working on the two of them might not have been the best idea, but with my lights it's drying rather quickly, so okay, so then I'm going to add just a little bit here of the scarlet, really wet on wet here. And I'm just kind of doing small brush strokes that carry up at an interesting sort of line of clouds here. Okay, and then I want some of this blue, but I want to tone it down a little bit. So I'm reaching up here to my area where I mix the grays, and I'm bringing some of that color down here. This kind of gives me a dusky grayer color. And I'm going to do a bit of that. I didn't test it, and it's rather dark. But this color will mix easier with the orange than a blue would. And it gives me the look of some softer clouds. So I'm just going to kind of move it around in here. And I've been noticing how some big puffy clouds often have darker look on the under edge of the clouds. So we're going to play with that idea. Oh, actually, that was kind of the color I needed down here. I'm going to let those colors just kind of flood together a little bit. I probably suggest you do these one at a time. Can control a little bit more of your drying time if you're only thinking about one and not jumping back and forth to both of them. And now I'm going to bring in some more of these purpley colors. Clean water. I'm going to get this whole area wet. Soften it a bit with the water. Bring in some of the phthalo blue. Okay to leave some of that white. That lifted some yellow that I'm going to mop up a little bit. I'm softening the watermark between those two colors. Bringing in some more of this purpley color here. I was invited down to Crystal Cove with my friend Barb, And we were down there on a Sunday afternoon that was so gray. There was just very little color to the ocean at all. And we were sitting out on the porch of our wonderful little cottage. And as the sun went down, suddenly we got this incredible sunset with all of this color in the sky and reflected in the water. It was absolutely amazing. And I don't think I'd ever really studied the look of it, thinking about painting, you know, in terms of how much color is reflected in the sky or in the water. And here were the waves looked pink, you know, coming in on the shore, and it was just incredible. And we sat there and painted by lantern light as long as we could, and that was just a very special, fun experience. Thank you, Barb and Bill. Since this color got as dark as it did and it gave me a hard line, I'm going to work with that and go darker as though that's my shoreline. And for that I'm going to go up here and get some of this kind of grayer dark color. And make an interesting edge that might be the water's edge here. Now that those background colors have dried to where they're just damp, I'm able to add a little bit more definition here to the sky. And again, by doing some kind of lift of clouds moving up this way, that seems to give me an interesting effect. I'm reaching my gray area of the palette, and I'm going to dip into some of this old brown that was sitting there. Okay, so this allows me to have the much darker look here, as though they're sitting on the land here. And we would have quite a high contrast between the figures sitting here against the sunset, where we'd have a very dark shadows there behind them. I want to make the water area over here a little bit more interesting. So let's get a rather pale bit of scarlet. That looks a bit too dark, so I'm just going to let it wash. And now, since I've added this down here, I better let that dry. You can see here I used some little strokes to do some reflection. So our little kayaker here, I added some blue shadows behind him. And this little bit of blue over here sort of made it look like land over there in the distance. On this one you can see letting it just get that wet actually worked quite nicely. I'm just sort of skipping around here. I wanted a little bit more blue in this one. Okay, that adds some interest. Some of the colors being translucent are kind of overlapping, and that works okay. And we would have some darker blues down here. It doesn't have to be an exact reflection by any means. And of course the water makes the reflections be much more fluid. And I'll do some smaller brush strokes off in the distance. And over here we need a little bit more color. The lines that are a part of the stamp help show you where you would have some shadowing directly behind the boat. Maybe we'll make them a little bit darker and kind of go that direction. And again, these details are holding in place because the background has had a chance to dry a little bit more. And that's kind of untested there, wasn't it? And if my sun is over here, then a little bit darker on this side is good. That area was wet enough to go above my horizon line, so I'm lifting it away with just barely damp, clean brush. Okay, so that gave you a chance to see it in motion. And again, this one here is still my favorite. And I haven't stamped on it because I wanted to show it to you just like that. And so whether you stamp before or after is your choice, and you can experiment a little bit and work at seeing what you have in the sky, and then loosely, very more fluid approach to reflected in the foreground. Here we have a very fun skyline of the big city. And the stamp itself is this part, and you can stamp it twice, and it's going to give you the perspective of you're seeing down this street and into the distance. But here I tried stamping it an additional time, and I liked that it wasn't quite so symmetrical here, and this kind of mixed it up a little bit. And I've taped my paper down. But I think it's a good plan to stamp on some scrap paper and decide exactly what you're going to do. And so in this case as well, I've stamped first. Make sure you get a nice, good Versamark ink in the black, so that this one is very difficult to touch up if you don't get a good impression to start with. So I've stamped that 3 times up there, as you can see. And I practiced what I was going to stamp on this one as well. I realized it was kind of out of sight, but that allowed me to plan it a little bit better before I went to paper. And again, each one is a little bit different, but I want to make sure you can see and get any tips that I can pass on to you. Okay, we'll move this one for the best visibility on our skyline first. I'm going to start with quite a bit of water on this one. I'm going to wet the entire taped area. I'm going to start with my yellow. And if you want to practice just getting bands of color, I think I started with that, and then when things weren't blending, it got more interesting, and yours may do the same. That's okay. Okay, so yellow, and while the yellow is still wet, I'm going to add a little bit of the Gamboge, and that's looking kind of intense there. So if I want to add some water, that may just kind of blend it across. I've got a little something in there that I don't want. Okay, and then I'm going to, if you want to add a bit of the scarlet, this again is going to be the easy way for these colors to mix. And then I'm adding rose. And again, you just want it soft. And I knew my brush was really wet. I didn't test it there. But I'm letting the water do a lot of this interesting mixing. And now if I go to purple, that is going to mix beautifully with my pinks. And let's see if we get a nice magenta kind of purple so that it works well with. And I do want the sky to get darker up here, so I'm making sure that's a pretty intense bit of purple. This one had a lot more blue, but if I were to add blue down here now, of course I would get green, and I don't think I want that. So if I want to add some interest, I might work my way back from the purples into the pinks here, and a big wet brush is just kind of letting all this color move around. Yeah, the stripes are gone. That's okay. Come back with a bit of the scarlet. Okay, and we don't want these hard lines, so we're going to flood some more water. And that may give us some interesting effects as well. Okay, and then we might just do a little bit more intense color down here. Not quite that intense. We don't want to draw around sun necessarily, but luckily it's still damp and I can lift it away. That's just going to take your eye to the end of that long street there, isn't it? Okay, and with the damp brush, as you can see up here, I attempted to lift some color. So a damp brush with quite a bit of pressure, I want to think about the shape I'm creating, and that just adds some interest. Soften that, and we'll let it dry. The larger the panel that you're working with, the quicker you might need to work, or the more water you may need to add. So start small and then keep adding more. Okay, so let's try some quick colors on this one as well. Let's go in the reverse order this time. Let's start with our blues and purples up here at the top. I kind of like the interesting bits of white there that happen with a dry brush, but to blend it together we've sort of let it go. So again, think of the shapes of your brush strokes here, and then next to the blue we can add some of this phthalo blue. That blue next to scarlet is not going to, it's going to give us a lot of this dark color. So I'm going to go to a little bit more of this magenta. And then back to rose. And again, these are just the way these colors are going to mix the best. That's a little bit too intense. I've got a whole bunch of scarlet on my brush. But a soft scarlet would be just what we need to mix next. Since I'm getting an awkward water line, I'm going to get a wet brush going across the whole thing. Okay, now I'm going to add, and that was too much. Okay, that worked better. And again, I need to check that I'm not getting strange colors because of my swamp cleanup. Okay, and a little bit of the yellow down here at the bottom. And it might fade and then get a little bit more intense perhaps right along the horizon line. Yeah, you just never know what interesting little cloud things will happen. And as you're trying to maybe blend two colors, you get some interesting little clouds happening along there that's kind of fun. Oh, and this is fun up here, the way it dried. What I removed kind of moved in a little bit more, but that's still quite interesting. I might decide I'm okay with just a little bit darker bit of color up here at the top. And it's mostly dry, so a rather wet brush and paying attention to the shape of my brush strokes. But now if I add a little bit more of that, building on where there was some dark anyway, that will look like the underside of some of these clouds. You have to have some clouds to get a beautiful sunrise or sunset. Okay, and now that needs to dry a little bit before we take the tape off. So have some fun making your own interesting sunrises and sunsets, and learn to observe what you see in the sky each day. So here we have the reveal of all the ones we painted today in our workshop 108, and I hope you've had fun and will try your hand at all of these fun watercolor techniques.